Spring 1976. France, Nice. A man walks into the most secure bank in France with an alarm clock in his pocket. He is Albert Spaggiari, a portrait photographer. He rents a safety deposit box. He locks the clock inside. He goes home and waits. Because here is what he needs to know. When that clock starts screaming at midnight, deep inside the vault, will anyone hear it? Midnight comes. Nothing happens. No call, no siren, no police. In the dark, for the first time in months, Albert Spaggiari smiles. In 60 days, he and 20 men will dig a tunnel from the city's sewers into the floor of that vault. 8 meters, 96 hours, 371 boxes, $10 million. On the wall, they will leave one sentence: without hatred, without violence, without weapons. So how does a portrait photographer beat the most secure bank in France and vanish before anyone catches him? Albert Spaggiari is 43 years old. He owns a small portrait studio on Rue de France. Wedding photos, first communions, family portraits in the back garden against a cloth backdrop he changes every Monday. He charges fair prices. He smiles for difficult mothers-in-law. He gives sweets to the children who refuse to sit still. Most of his clients have no idea who he used to be. At 19, he enlisted as a paratrooper in the First Indochina War. He came back from the jungle with a medal, a head full of things he never talked about, and a quiet contempt for institutions. In the years after, he drifted through several lives. Photographer in a small Italian-French town, chicken farmer in the hills above Nice, a stone farmhouse, a rusted gate, a few dozen birds, a typewriter on the kitchen table where he wrote angry letters to newspapers that never published him. He once spent time in prison for a small armed robbery he committed as a young man, to impress a girlfriend. He came out of prison different, smarter, patient. He told friends he had no interest in being caught again. By 1976, he looks like a soft, smiling, provincial businessman. He is not. For over a year, he has been studying one specific building 3 streets from his studio. Every detail, every routine, every employee shift, the opening times, the cleaning schedule, the day the armored truck arrives and the day it leaves, the names of the security guards, the angle of the cameras in the lobby ceiling. He has been inside it dozens of times. He has stood at the counter, paid small fees in cash, asked harmless questions, watched. By the spring of 1976, he knows the bank better than most of the people who work there. The Société Générale on Rue de l'Hôtel des Postes, the bank that holds the fortunes of half the most powerful families on the French Riviera. The bank that everyone in France considers impossible to rob. Albert Spaggiari has decided to find out if that's true. To understand why the Société Générale on Rue de l'Hôtel des Postes was considered impossible to rob, you need to understand what was inside it. Beneath the bank's marble lobby, behind a single steel door, lay the largest private vault in southern France. 4,000 individual safety deposit boxes, stacked floor to ceiling along every wall. Steel-reinforced concrete on all 6 sides. Walls thicker than a grown man's arm. A massive, time-locked vault door that closed at 6 o'clock every Friday evening and could not be opened by anyone, including the bank's own director, until Tuesday morning. Inside those 4,000 boxes lived the private wealth of the Côte d'Azur, industrialists from Marseille, hotel owners from Cannes, aging aristocrats with villas in the hills above Monaco, cash that had never been declared, gold smuggled out of Algeria during the colonial collapse, diamonds in velvet pouches, bonds, wills, mistresses' love letters, photographs of people doing things that, if those photographs ever surfaced, would end careers and marriages across the south of France. Even the mayor of Nice, Jacques Médecin, was rumored to keep a box of his own. For the people who used those boxes, the appeal was simple. The bank kept no central register of what was inside any individual box. Once you locked the door, your secret was your own. Half the wealth in those boxes officially didn't exist anywhere on Earth. The Société Générale building had been designed around a single, simple idea. You can't rob what you can't reach. The walls were the defense. The time lock was the defense. The 4-day shutdown over the holiday weekend wasn't a vulnerability. It was the entire point. By the time anyone noticed something was wrong on a Tuesday morning, any thief would already be on a different continent, assuming they ever made it through that wall in the first place. And nobody in the entire history of French banking ever had. And because the bank's engineers were so confident in their walls, they had made one small decision that would prove to be the most expensive mistake in the bank's history. They had not installed a sound alarm. Why would they? The vault was buried under a meter of steel and concrete. There were motion sensors on the door. There were cameras in the lobby above. The building was monitored. The streets were patrolled. Nobody was getting into that vault. But Albert Spaggiari hadn't been looking at the vault. He had been looking at the dirt underneath it. The alarm clock was the first move, but it wasn't the first move he had made. For weeks before he ever rented that safety deposit box, Spaggiari had been doing something quieter and stranger. He had been walking the streets of Nice with copies of the city's 19th century sewer maps tucked under his arm. Nice, like most old Mediterranean cities, sits on a labyrinth. Underneath the boulevards, beneath the cafes and the postcards, runs an entire second city of stone tunnels, old enough that some sections still date back to Napoleon. Some are wide enough for a man to stand, some barely wide enough for a man to crawl on his stomach. Spaggiari spent nights down there, alone, with a flashlight and a compass, mapping the tunnels, counting his steps, triangulating against the streets above. He emerged in the small hours of the morning, smelling of waste and damp stone, and went home to wash and sleep before opening his studio at 9. What he found was this: a municipal storm drain, 8 meters away from the floor of the Société Générale vault. 8 meters of dirt, then concrete, then steel, then more concrete, on a straight line. Now he needed a team, not friends, not amateurs. Men who could keep their mouths shut and their hands steady underground for 60 straight nights. He traveled to Marseille and met with men he had known from the criminal underworld of the south of France. By the late spring of 1976, Spaggiari had assembled a team of around 20. Some were welders, some were locksmiths, some were ex-soldiers like himself. Years later, the French press would give them a nickname that stuck: Le Gang des Égoutiers, the sewer gang. He paid out of his own pocket. He promised them shares of whatever they pulled out of the vault. In May 1976, the digging began. Every night after the last cafe in Nice closed, the team disappeared into the sewers. They worked in shifts, 4 to 6 men at a time. They strung hundreds of meters of electrical cable through the tunnels for lighting. They hauled in rubber rafts to ferry tools across the wider sections, and they carried out rubble in their pockets, a few handfuls at a time, so the city's sanitation crews wouldn't notice the dirt piling up downstream. Some of them stood waist-deep in human waste for 6 hours at a stretch. The smell was unbearable. The air was thinner than they expected. One man passed out from the fumes and had to be dragged back through the sewers to the surface. Another cut his hand on a piece of rusted iron in the dark, refused to come up for 2 more hours, and finished his shift bleeding through a rag tied around his wrist. Spaggiari himself, the soft, smiling photographer with the wedding portraits in his shop window, was down there with them every night. By the second week of July, after 60 nights of work, the tunnel was finished. 8 meters of hand-cut earth leading up to a thin shell of concrete that, on the other side, was the floor of the most secure private vault in France. Now, Spaggiari needed one more thing: time. He picked the date carefully: the 14th of July, 1976, Bastille Day, a long French weekend with the bank closed from Friday evening to Tuesday morning. 96 hours of complete privacy inside the vault. He told his men they would go in on the night of the 16th, Friday, July 16th, 1976, just past midnight. 20 men climb down into the storm drain beneath Rue de l'Hôtel des Postes. Acetylene torches, drills, picks, electric saws, sledgehammers, hydraulic jacks, 30 tanks of compressed gas, crates of food and water for 4 days. They crawl the last 8 meters of tunnel and reach the underside of the vault floor. It takes them most of the night to break through. They cut. They listen. They cut again. Every few minutes, a man at the entrance of the storm drain freezes. A footstep above on the boulevard. A car braking too hard. A stray shout from a late drinker outside a bar. And the entire team goes silent until the sound passes. Sometime in the early hours of Saturday morning, the last layer of reinforced concrete gives way, and Albert Spaggiari becomes the first uninvited human being in history to stand inside that vault. He looks up. 4,000 safety deposit boxes line the walls around him, floor to ceiling, on every side. And then he does something nobody had ever attempted. He turns to the great steel vault door, the one that the bank's engineers spent years designing to be unopenable from the outside, and he welds it shut from the inside. Now, nobody can get in, and nobody can get out until they finish. For the next 3 days, this room is theirs. They set up a folding picnic table in the middle of the vault. They unpack foie gras, baguettes, cheese, and bottles of red wine. They drag in air mattresses through the tunnel and stack them along one wall. And in shifts, around the clock, they begin to open boxes. They use a custom-built hydraulic press. Each box takes around 6 minutes from start to finish. 6 minutes, then the next. Cash in francs, dollars, Deutschmarks, gold ingots stamped with the seals of long-dead European foundries, stock certificates, diamonds and folded squares of black velvet, bundles of letters, some of them tied with ribbon. They take everything liquid. They leave the documents and the love letters scattered across the floor of the vault. By Sunday afternoon, they have opened 371 boxes. Then something starts to go wrong. Outside, above ground, a summer storm rolls in over the Côte d'Azur. Inside the sewers, below the vault, water is rising fast. If the storm drain floods, the team's only escape route, 8 meters of hand-cut tunnel, disappears under several feet of water. And the 8 men still working inside the vault disappear with it. They start packing up early. Before they leave, Spaggiari does the final thing he has been planning for over a year. He walks to a clean section of the vault wall. He hands each man in the team a different paint marker, a different color, a different style, and one letter at a time, with each letter painted by a different hand so that no single person's handwriting can ever be matched to the message. They write a single sentence onto the wall. Without hatred, without violence, without weapons. In the early hours of Monday morning, July 19th, the team disappears back into the sewers, dragging duffel bags of cash and gold behind them. They split up at the surface. They walk in different directions, into different cars, toward 20 different addresses across southern France. 8 hours later, the manager of Société Générale arrives at work. He places his hand on the great steel vault door. The time lock has released. The door should swing open. It does not move. He calls his assistant. They try together. Nothing. He calls the police. It takes police 6 hours to cut their way through the welded vault door from the outside. When they finally step inside, what they find immediately becomes one of the most photographed crime scenes in modern French history. The picnic table, still set, empty wine bottles, foie gras tins, air mattresses against the wall, 371 open boxes, diamonds and bonds and old love letters scattered across the floor, and the sentence painted on the wall. There is no sign of how anyone got in. Not until a junior officer, walking the perimeter of the vault, notices a small dark hole in the corner of the floor. By that evening, the entire south of France is talking about a robbery that nobody on any continent can quite believe. Newspapers begin calling it Le Casse du siècle, the heist of the century. The investigation is enormous. Hundreds of officers across multiple jurisdictions. Interpol. Searches of every known underworld safehouse from Marseille to the Italian border. Nightclubs raided. Known fences questioned. Banknotes from the missing francs flagged at every customs post in Western Europe. For 3 months, nothing. Then, in late October 1976, an ex-girlfriend of one of the team members walks into a police station in Marseille and gives up a name. Within a week, that name leads to 2 more. Within 2 weeks, the name of the man who organized everything reaches the police. Albert Spaggiari is arrested at Nice airport in early November as he steps off a flight. He smiles for the cameras. He smiles for the magistrates. He admits, calmly and completely, to organizing the heist. And then he refuses to give up a single one of his men. Not under questioning, not under threats, not under offers of a reduced sentence. He gives the police a long list of false names, false addresses, and stories that go nowhere. He apologizes for forgetting details. He smiles when they catch him in a contradiction. He is held in a Nice prison through the winter. On the morning of March 10, 1977, he is brought from his cell to the office of investigating Judge Richard Bouaziz for one more round of questioning. The room is on an upper floor of the Nice courthouse. The window is open. It's a warm spring day on the Riviera. A small group of police officers stands by the door. Spaggiari sits across from the judge and answers questions calmly, the way he has answered every question for 4 months. At one point, he leans across the desk and hands the judge a document, a hand-drawn diagram of part of the tunnel. Judge Bouaziz takes it. He looks down at the paper. Spaggiari stands up. He walks toward the window. He says he needs some air. And then Albert Spaggiari jumps. He drops 2 stories onto the roof of a parked Peugeot in the courtyard below, rolls off the roof into the street, and climbs onto the back of a motorcycle that has been idling at the curb for over an hour. The motorcycle is gone before anyone in the courthouse has reached the window. He will never set foot in France again. Some weeks later, the owner of the Peugeot opens his mailbox and finds an anonymous envelope. Inside is a check for 5,000 francs, made out to him personally, for the damage to his roof. There is no return address. There is no signature. There is no note. Albert Spaggiari spends the rest of his life in Argentina under a series of false names. A French court tries him in absentia and sentences him to life imprisonment. The sentence will never be served. The Société Générale never recovers most of the money. Of the estimated 46 million francs lifted from that vault, about $10 million at the time, closer to 30 million euros today, only a handful of gold bars are ever traced. And many of the depositors, wealthy, secretive, and reluctant to admit what they had been keeping in those boxes, never come forward to claim their losses. The bank quietly settles a few claims. The rest of the money simply disappears into the criminal economy of Southern Europe. In 1978, from a hideout somewhere in Latin America, Spaggiari publishes a memoir titled Les Égouts du Paradis, The Sewers of Paradise. The book becomes a bestseller in France. 2 films are made about him within a decade. And in 2018, an aging Marseille mobster named Jacques Cassandre will publish his own book, claiming he, not Spaggiari, was the real architect of the heist. A French court will ban the book and convict Cassandre of money laundering. But by then, Albert Spaggiari is already long gone. On June 10, 1989, in the small town of Hyères on the French coast, an old woman walks out of her house and finds her son lying in the courtyard. He is 56 years old. The cancer in his lungs has finally caught up with him. He has spent the last 12 years of his life moving between Buenos Aires, Madrid, and a quiet villa somewhere in the south of France that no police officer ever managed to find. He never returned a single franc to the families he stole from. He never gave up a single one of his men. And from the moment he stepped through the window of Judge Richard Bouaziz's office on the 10th of March, 1977, to the morning his mother found his body, 12 years later, Albert Spaggiari did not spend one more day inside a French prison. Without hatred, without violence, without weapons. Just one alarm clock, 8 meters of tunnel, and a long, quiet weekend in the most secure vault in France.